I have today been informed by Chairman Khrushchev that all of the IL-28 bombers now in Cuba will be withdrawn in 30 days. He also agrees that these planes can be observed and counted as they leave. Inasmuch as this goes a long way towards reducing the danger which faced this hemisphere 4 weeks ago, I have this afternoon instructed the Secretary of Defense to lift our naval quarantine.
But there were moments at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis when some members of the Joint Chiefs had been hoping for an order to invade Cuba. Were very furious that Kennedy had resolved this crisis peacefully. And they felt a great opportunity had been lost to invade Cuba, to test out new weapons, to get rid of Castro, and so on.
The mob, who wanted the gaming rights back in Havana, they were losing millions of dollars every day since Castro closed the casinos. The ultra-right wing, who hated President Kennedy for virtually everything he stood for. And the ultra-right wing hawks within the CIA, the ones who had been fired, or people related to those politically, who had been fired by President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. They all had a common goal. They wanted the president out of the way. They wanted Cuba clear of Castro and the communist threat in the Western Hemisphere. They had the most to gain. They had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to kill President Kennedy. If that is the cake, then the icing on the cake is the president's decision to withdraw the troops from Vietnam. That was the CIA's war. They wanted it, they wanted to promote it, they wanted to push it.
The people who I think had most to gain, as they saw it, were the military-industrial intelligence complex. It's a myth that the intelligence agencies don't make policy. They make it all the time. They always say they're carrying out policy, and sometimes they are. The people who had most to gain were those who didn't want the peace in the world that John Kennedy had tried to turn the world toward when he and Khrushchev worked out the solution to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The people who didn't want John Kennedy to be president were those who were making incredible fortunes from war production.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, and it was clear that there would be no invasion of Cuba, a rumor started to circulate among anti-Castro Cubans that Kennedy had made a secret deal with Khrushchev. According to the rumor, Khrushchev removed the missiles in exchange for Kennedy's agreement to end his hostilities with Cuba.
The anti-Castro Cubans here couldn't believe it. I mean, to them this was the utmost in traitorous behavior. Some anti-Castro Cubans even thought he was communist, thought he was a mole at the highest level, as it were. I mean, this is the kind of thinking that was going on at the time. And a tremendous hatred of Kennedy developed among the anti-Castro Cubans, and also among the CIA agents who, in fact, had become so associated with the anti-Castro Cubans and training them, and even going on raids with them, actually. Their sense of betrayal was as strong as that which the anti-Castro Cubans felt.
The anti-Castro Cubans were not getting the sympathy or support they once did, and they took out their frustrations at peace demonstrations, which, ironically, often turned violent. One of the most prominent peace groups was a pro-Cuba organization called Fair Play for Cuba. The New Orleans chapter of Fair Play for Cuba was manned by an ex-Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald. He was the only member of the chapter, and he was filmed passing out pro-Cuba literature on the streets. John F. Kennedy emerged from the Cuban Missile Crisis a new man and a new power. Standing up to the radical right and the vestiges of the Eisenhower administration, he was finally able to set his own agenda and enact his own policies and ideas. He took full advantage of the opportunity by calling for a test ban treaty.
Both Kennedy and Khrushchev stared into the nuclear abyss, and both of them were determined thereafter to move toward détente. And the first action in that was, of course, the American University speech, which followed by the negotiation of the test ban treaty.
At American University, He did the unthinkable. He extended a hand of peace to the Soviet Union.
Kennedy made a speech at American University in June of the year before he died, and he said, we live in one world, we got to breathe in the same air, and we got to live together, we're going to die together. He was very disturbed by our involvement in Vietnam, which he inherited. And there came a time when he called his generals in and spoke to them, and after he spoke to them, the Pentagon issued a small statement saying that we have re-evaluated our involvement in Vietnam and find that we can begin to withdraw our men. The plan was to begin by withdrawing 1,000 a month. 17,000 were to be withdrawn by the time of the election, which was a year later. One plane load reached the United States when John Kennedy was killed. 3 days after the assassination, the body wasn't yet in the ground. The Pentagon issued what it called a re-evaluation of its re-evaluation. And they said simply that we found that our re-evaluation was optimistic. And the rest is history. The whole world turned around on it.
Had Kennedy lived, I think we'd have had no Vietnam War with all of its traumatic and divisive influences in America. I think we would have escaped that. I think the world would have escaped the 50,000 odd Americans dead and 300,000 more wounded and over 500,000 more hooked on dangerous drugs and tropical diseases. The divisiveness of that war that so many of the people thought unjustified and unnecessary and it shouldn't have been there. It split this country widely, and many of those things have lingered on since.
Former FBI agent and professional investigator Bill Turner has been researching the JFK assassination since the weekend it happened. His exhaustive probing has given him exceptional insight into the events and reasons surrounding Kennedy's death.
There was much anger over his failure to provide air cover at the Bay of Pigs. There was much anger when he did not invade Cuba during the missile crisis in October 1962. After the Bay of Pigs, John Kennedy reamed out the CIA for conducting too high a profile, meaning an invasion. And he said he wanted to continue the campaign against Castro, but he wanted it so it was low profile and invisible. And so the Kennedy brothers did develop a secret agenda, and Bobby was a protagonist in which there would be a series of sabotage raids, there would be continued assassination attempts against Castro, and there would be teams ready to go into Cuba if the time was right for a second invasion. I am very convinced that the assassination of John F. Kennedy came from the collaboration between the CIA and the Mafia in attempting to assassinate Fidel Castro. And I feel very strongly that that apparatus that was set up to assassinate Castro simply was turned on Kennedy when the motive piled upon motive to get rid of him.
Building on the foundations laid by Bill Turner, using classified documents newly released under the Kennedy Assassination Records Act, the investigation into the Kennedy brothers' secret agenda against Fidel Castro has been greatly extended. Project Freedom is the name given to that agenda by two Atlantan writers and researchers. Over the last 7 years, Lamar Waldron has built up a formidable database on this secret agenda and its relationship to Kennedy's murder. Together with colleague Tom Hartman, they have gained unique access to individuals closest to these events and have unraveled some of the darkest secrets lying at the heart of the assassination.
Project Freedom, again, was Bobby Kennedy's project that he ran only with his most trusted advisors. So you had Bobby at the top, based in Washington, and also based much of the time in Washington, you had his Cuban confidant. That was Bobby's main liaison with the other small handful of exile leaders that he trusted to work on Project Freedom with him. Those leaders would sometimes contact Bobby directly, but most of the time they would go through his Cuban confidant.
So a second invasion of Cuba was being planned, using a force of Cuban exiles.